sports talk here. Hot summer day here, July 4th. Um, as we move into the month of July here, we're coming off both the NBA and NHL drafts just in the past week, and and with the Flyers season coming up and the Sixers season, um, there's some interesting things of note coming off the draft and the past week. As right now in this time, I mean, with the Phillies struggling and likely not going to be a playoff team, likely going to have to rebuild. There's not really much else to talk about in Philadelphia sports right now until training. Until Eagles preseason begins. This training camp's a few weeks away. But definitely some interesting moves made with both the Flyers and the Sixers this past week. First off, the NBA draft last week with the 76'ers making quite a buzzworthy move. Um, Now some fans, criticize this certainly that the Sixers gave up Drew Holiday, and in the draft they got a couple young players. Um, and a lot of people criticize that. Oh, why would they give up their best player and they get a guy with an ACL, coming off an ACL problem and getting ACL surgery, etc. Well, let's first of all let's just make it clear and it's obvious. The Sixers organization essentially they hit the reset button and they're starting this thing from scratch for the most part. Um, on top of that, they're the only NBA team, the last NBA team left who doesn't have a coach yet, which obviously they're going to get, they're searching for. But the Sixers organization hit the reset button, and Drew Holiday. I mean, he's a solid player. I mean, he's not. Some people would maybe joke he's the skinniest guy in a group of fat guys. Because obviously this he's a solid player, but on a Sixers team that if you were to enter next season with the same Sixers team, minus Bynum now, of course, you wouldn't really get an interesting season at all. I mean, you'd have another lackluster season. There, no progress. But the Sixers now, even though next year they may not even win 20 games, but just the fact that they hit the reset button, they're starting from scratch. In the NBA, sometimes it's what you have to do. Just the way. Sometimes it's just the way it goes in the NBA. It's going to create buzz, at the very least. And sure, I mean, they'll tank next season. Although next year's NBA draft has been touted as being a loaded one. So even if the Sixers tank next season, I mean, they perhaps get some great picks in the draft next year, and depending who they get for the coach, they can rebuild this thing. So in a few, perhaps in 3 years they may be a playoff team again. And the way it seems to work in the NBA is, if you don't, sometimes you just got to hit the reset button, blow it up, and start it over again because you never know. I mean, unless you're like the Miami Heat, who seem to get together several superstar players and franchises like that. You get, on the other hand, you get stuck in a spot like the Sixers were in, they couldn't proceed with what they had. I mean, they might have, you know, for all I know, they probably wouldn't have done any better this last season. Um, and they're gonna have to, you know, they're just gonna have to start over. And people want to say how, they get a guy with an ACL tear, but they don't understand that the whole concept of ACL surgery is that you come back with stronger, stronger ligaments there. It's not like a guy who blows out a knee and it's never the same again. That's a different story. Um, and these are young prospects that perhaps with the right coaching, the right development, who knows? They could be decent players. They could eventually become a decent team again, um, in a few years, and it's going to take some time. And it's that's the bottom line right now. We can't you can't you, for now. We just got to leave it at that, and hope for the best. I mean, again, I'm sure they're going to tank next season.
I agree.
And I mean, but on the plus side, they should be getting some, better draft picks next year, and maybe they'll get lucky with the way the whole NBA draft lottery works, and get the right, you know, uh, get that magic ping pong ball that gets them the number one pick maybe in the draft. Who knows? The way they do things there, but so we have that, and you know, at least they're refiltering, sort of in ways that the Flyers have been refiltering their team. Now, obviously, and of course the Eagles. Um, Although the Flyers, they're obviously Peter Laviolette is didn't go anywhere, which he shouldn't have. But this year could definitely be a rather telling year as to whether or not Peter Laviolette continues to be the Flyers head coach or not. It's a pivotal year, and I think if the Flyers do not make the playoffs this coming season, then there'd be some you know unmet expectations in my eyes, and perhaps Laviolette would be gone after that. I'm hoping at least that the Flyers make the playoffs this coming year, because they got a goaltender situation and a defensive situation that they have to rebuild. They I would have thought that they were going to make the playoffs last year. Even the shortened season, maybe that messed with things a little bit. I don't know. They lose Yager, Pronger. They had some injury issues certainly, and the goaltending issue and the defense fell apart. But hopefully the Flyers, the moves that they're making, are going to help them progress. Now they had the draft this past weekend, and they picked up a couple defensemen, rather large defensemen. Um, what was he, a 6'7" guy? Of course, a few weeks ago they signed Mark Straight. I believe that's how you say it. And so they got some new defensive guys. They got a couple prospects maybe that they're gonna play through the minors, and from what I've been hearing, there at the time there was a better defenseman on the board according to TSN scouts that they could have taken, but they took a rather large guy who, a 17-year-old. Um, he's gonna be turning 18, I guess, in a few weeks, but at the time, a 17-year-old. How about just think about that. Who you know, again, he's 6'7". He's a rather large guy. Clearly it sounds like he's been eating his spinach, and so. Um, Bottom line is, you know, they kind of picked a guy though who's not afraid to drop the gloves. It's something that you know the whole thing with the Broad Street Bullies and the Flyers ownership and management um, seems to be tied to getting you know hard nosed guys like that, and um, I mean we shall see, but how that worked, if that helps the defense, clearly, I mean, I personally, the whole fighting thing, and you know, I mentioned this before, when I was talking about the Flyers last time on TW Sports Talk. Um, it's not all about, hockey is not always about, drilling guys in the boards, getting these huge hits. I mean, it's nice, it's pretty cool when it happens, um, sometimes, but that's not all what the game's about, you know. And this is, I mean, I think back to games like Flyers versus Ottawa when they were so many guys were getting in fights and suspended, um, that they were running out of players on the bench to even, at one point at one point they were almost ran out of players to even have 5-on-5 hockey. So it's you know I look back at games like that and I remember, but that's not what the game's about. That's not how you win. That those things don't really have true implications on winning. Um, they got to get smart. They got to have smart guys on hand to play with. That's the bottom line. And you know, they of course they also then signed Vinny Lecavalier on the offensive side as a center, who's thus far played his entire career. Um, I believe in at the Tampa Bay Lightning. Um, he's put up some impressive numbers. He's been a former cover athlete from NHL '06, and he's 33 now. He's not, in recent years. Last year he had some injury issues, and in recent years there's been a decline. Um, he was quite productive, I think, 2008, 2009, and then he just kind of hit a wall where there was a noticeable decline, in his production, and it hasn't really been any improvement since. The Flyers signed him to a 5-year contract, I believe at 22 million, and on the back end of this deal, maybe the latter 2 years, he'll be older, and you wonder how much that'll he'll really be worth. The thing is, if the Flyers brought him in, hopefully not to expect him to produce at the rate that he was producing, you know, several years ago. He's 33 now. He's not going to be as productive as he used to be. Now, if they brought him in to maybe score 25 goals, 30, 35 assists, if he puts up 60, 65 points this season, and that's kind of what, then that's I think that's pretty good expectation. I think that will be a job well done, um, at least for that first season of the contract, and I think he'd be a good second line center. Um, Now, they need. The thing is, also, it's almost as if he's like a replacement to Danny Briere. Um, you know, the Flyers needed. I think last year they did lack some veteran leadership, and Leclavier coming in. He can be a veteran leader. One of those guys. Um, Giroux, obviously, team captain. Obviously, he's a leader of the team, but get another guy like Lecavalier in there, um, former Cup winner. He's had some impressive seasons in his career. Um, Good to have some. He could be a good veteran leader on the especially second line center. if they can, you got Wayne Simmons probably in that line, and trying to think who else. Maybe Couturier, or I'm not totally sure. See how it pans out, but um, I think that would be good leadership there for for the team, uh, and it's I think as long as they're not expecting too much from Lecavalier, because the Flyers have done made moves like this in the past um, many times. They bring in a veteran guy and they expect a lot from him, expect him to produce the way he was, and then he just doesn't produce, but produce the way that they hoped he would. And they overpay a guy. Hopefully that's not the case here. I mean, but he could be, you know, satisfyingly productive coming this year, and he's widely considered to be, one of the best one-timer guys in the league. Uh, you know, so and with having said that, play to your strengths with the guy too. I mean, take that into consideration when you got one of the guys who are probably the best one-time shooters in the league. They ought to think about executing those with a guy like Lecavalier. Um, you know, as often as they can, as long as opportunities like that open up. Because he can certainly put in one timers pretty darn well. So that would be definitely something to consider. And yeah, I mean he can get some good assists, etc. And I think he can be a decent addition to this team. Hopefully he stays healthy. But some guys, I notice some people are, you know, maybe haters. They're like, oh, what a waste of money, overpaying, classic Flyer move in a dumb way, and another dumb Flyers move. And, it's I don't quite think you can say that just yet. Before this, before we really see what he does this year, because certainly he could be a nice addition that helps helps the team, especially probably on the second line, which is more likely than not where he'll be. So you know, helping a young guy like Wayne Simmons, and, you got a veteran, another veteran, veteran guy there, I think will help. Along with a guy like Mark Strait, captain of the Islanders, former. So I think decent moves. The right now, it seems like the uh, the agent of Tim Thomas, as earlier today I've heard this that they're in talks with the Flyers. Um, so there's a possibility that former Boston Bruins goalie, who was one of the best goaltenders in the league, um, he could they're talking. They're in talks with the Flyers. Those Tim Thomas's agent. They're in talks with the Flyers right now. So we'll have to wait and see. The the thing is the the cap space with the Flyers right now after the moves that they've made. They don't have much cap space. So depending on how much you know these talks are continuing, how much money would be you know asked for. Depending if the Flyers maybe free up a little more cap space, might depend on whether or not they get Tim Thomas in between the pipes for the upcoming season. And now the guy didn't play last season, and he's up there in age. He's 39. He's 39 now, but um, that's not age is not quite as big of a deal normally with goaltenders. Sometimes it depends on the goaltender a little bit. I mean, Dominic Hasek was playing, well up in his 30s, and he was still like, perhaps the best goaltender in the league. Patrick Raw, another guy around the same time. Um, so that's not always an issue. Um, especially for the best goalies, and even if he was a decent, even if he wasn't, even quite as good, he could still be solid. I think definitely an improvement over Brizgalov. I think. So that could work out, even if it's only for a year. And you also got Mason that you're curious about. He's they got a young goaltender there that they could consider. If he was the backup to Tim Thomas, you could see what he does. I guess on games that Tim Thomas wouldn't play. It's always nice sometimes to have that, to see what a young backup goalie could do. Um, he'd be playing fewer games, of course, but you see how they do um, with him and Ned as well. And Tim Thomas, if he does sign with the Flyers, and if then he would decide to permanently step away from the game and whatnot, then you have Mason. You decide from there. So I think either way, they can always find out what they have in Mason this season, whether he's a backup goalie or they can find out more about him. Because right now you don't totally know. You wonder if you want to have him really be the starting goaltender, the main goaltender. Um, Not quite likely to happen, but you have him as a backup. Maybe see how he does alongside a more established goaltender, and go from there. And you know if he exceeds expectations, he performs quite well. Then in the future, you can maybe have him as your main goaltender, um, or not. But they can obviously address that situation accordingly. But we'll have to wait and see. If Tim Thomas ends up with the Philadelphia Flyers, they're in talks, and as far as teams needing to address the goaltender situation, um, the Flyers would perhaps be the team that would have the most potential, I think, of winning out of other teams that don't really have a strong goaltending situation. So that's what you know. That's where we're at right now, and it'll be interesting to see if they do get Tim Thomas, and you know the goaltender with the rather interesting mustache. Some call it.
What's mustache ride?
That would definitely create some buzz, I think, too, as well. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there, but it'll certainly be interesting. Definitely in the coming days to see what else the Flyers do. See what this new Sixers coach comes along, who it may be, etc. So that these things will kind of hold us over, you know, up until the Eagles begin training camp, um, and during the baseball All Star break, and if the Phillies even if they show any hope of really you know make making a run this year at the playoffs, it's looking a little bleak for the most part. So yeah, it's right now just kind of looking forward to training camp and seeing what goes on with the off seasons of the Flyers and the 76'ers. So with that in mind, that'll conclude this edition of TW Sports Talk. Thanks as always for tuning in, and as always, I encourage continued listening, as we'll probably talk more as we get closer to Eagles training camp, and update you on whatever else may occur in the near future with these off seasons of the 76ers and the Flyers.